All right, thank you, everyone. I will try not to put you to sleep after that break. All right, so we have panelists coming up in a few minutes, but before I do that, I just kind of wanted to set the stage, lay the groundwork for what we're going to talk about. Just recently as last month, we had a research study done by KRC, which looked into Asian domiciled companies. These are companies with headquarters somewhere in Asia, interviewed and surveyed more than 200 C-level managing executives, senior managers, and asked them questions regarding their plans for expanding outside of their countries as well as outside of Asia. Now, this was in the context of post-COVID, because in most of these markets, they are thinking beyond just COVID era and looking at what's down the road for us in 2023 and beyond. The survey was conducted between September 14th and September 29th. So this is very, very fresh data, all right? Even I have not had a chance to parse through this that deeply, so I have notes, okay? So do not blame me if I keep looking down here. I'm not cheating, but I just want to make sure I get the numbers right, okay? The main targets were the four largest economies in Asia: China, Japan, Korea, India. And Singapore was also included in the interview portion because they wanted to get some quotes and delve into some of these answers in more depth. The companies were all large in the context of revenues. All had revenues greater than 100 million US dollars. Half of them were above 1 billion in revenues, sales. And they covered industries such as automotive, entertainment, finance, hospitality, manufacturing, and of course, IT, telecom. So the main focus, there were a lot of questions, but I'm not going to go into every one of them. The main ones were focused on understanding their reasons for wanting to go beyond their markets or beyond their region, and identifying some of the challenges in 2022 and beyond, and some of the risks that they foresee having to face as they embark on this expedition. And we'll look into that, starting with the why, okay? So the why focused on companies' reasons for wanting to expand beyond their local markets. Obviously, and a lot of these may be common sense to you, but when we look at the data, it's nice to put some numbers next to some of the rationale. So growing revenue is the primary reason for expanding outside of their local markets. And after that, efficiencies in production and operations, i.e. cost savings, are another big reason for these companies saying that they wanted to go beyond their local markets. And then you get down to the next level, and we're looking at attracting investors, mitigating risks, spreading out their risk beyond just one or two markets, and tapping into new talent pools. Okay, so we take a look at some of the numbers here, and you will see that these are, again, aggregate numbers from China, Japan, India, and Korea. And you can see here that 70% said that increasing revenues and profits was a very important reason for going global, the largest share among these 9 options that were given. This is very true in India and South Korea, where 82% said that it was very important, compared to only 59% if you look at China and Japan separately. So there are some differences within the countries, but again, in this particular table, you will see them all aggregated into APAC. Declining demand at home was also cited as one of the key reasons for wanting to go global. 64% of Japanese respondents said that this was a very important reason, while only 32% of Korean executives said this was very important. Okay, so again, a gap there that's kind of interesting when you look at it from a bird's eye point of view. Taking advantage of efficiencies in business operations was the second most common, very important reason to go global, and that was 63%. This is important especially in China and India, where 74% said it was very important versus 56% in Korea and Japan. And then you get into other factors such as wanting to attract investors from outside their local markets, and in some cases, planning for an IPO, okay? And again, these are all details that I can't go into right now, obviously, because we only have 40 minutes now. All right, so what are some of the key factors that companies consider before going global? This is the next category of questions that were posed to our 200 plus respondents. Well, you have here companies saying that they wanted to prioritize evaluating consumer demand and local cultures when expanding as a major factor. Another factor was that they had to consider was related to regulations, legal systems, and the infrastructure in those markets they were targeting, and also evaluating the global and local market stability. And this is something that we could probably do a separate section on, stability, geopolitics, and so forth. But in this particular case, we're just gonna leave it at that. If you look at the list in order of popularity of how companies responded, the top factor for going global was, the top factor to consider when going global was looking at the demand for products and services in that market or markets, the ease or ability to navigate the local culture. And in this particular case, you will see in the data companies saying that they prefer staying in Asia as long as they can, because it's very comfortable for them. They know how to communicate with other Asian markets better. They are not feeling the kind of pushback that they might get in quote unquote Western markets. So these were some of the things that you would see in the data. Political and economic stability, obviously this is something that we could also talk about in depth, but this is a concern mostly for respondents from China. Competition in other markets, for example, especially in IT or telecoms, if there was a very strong local player, then that would have a big role in deciding whether or not to go into that particular market. So mostly in advanced markets. And other factors to consider were incentives, local incentives such as tax breaks, land, so forth for manufacturers, local infrastructure, which means roads and ports and all that stuff, and obviously the talent pool. So some said that they wanted to go into a particular market, but there just wasn't enough knowledge or skill. They had to pull back and wait a little bit longer. So these are all factors that our respondents mentioned as key reasons for deciding to go or not go into a market. Another category that was covered in this survey were the risks and challenges. You see here that Asia domiciled companies, those with headquarters in Asia, faced a myriad of challenges when expanding. Some of those key challenges included understanding the customer demand in those markets, supply chain issues for manufacturers especially, talent, as was mentioned in the previous category regarding factors, now it's also a challenge, complying with local laws and regulations, navigating local cultures, and some other challenges that were not in as important as the previous mentioned ones, would include foreign exchange rates, tariffs, and so forth. All right, so in this particular table, you are seeing an aggregation of the responses from the survey participants when it comes to the challenges that they face when going abroad or overseas. Okay, understanding consumer demand was one of the most common challenges from the list of 16 factors. 52% overall said it was very significant, and this was more than any other factor. Supply chain issues were among the top three, and nearly 4 in 10, 38% said supply chain issues were a top concern. And among that group, 46% of the Indian participants said that this was very significant. More than 1 in 4, 27% said that lack of talent in those target markets to run their local operations or to run their operations in that country was a top 3 challenge, higher than any factor except for the supply chain issue factor. More than a quarter said complying with local regulations and laws was a top 3 challenge, tied with the lack of talent. And 51% said understanding culture is very significant. A very difficult one to crack, they said. India was the exception, though, because only 12% said that that was a top 3 issue. Chinese respondents, more than anyone else, any other country, said that trade disputes was a top 3 concern. And among them, Japan only said, only 18% in Japan said the same. So again, that was a quick look at some of the challenges that our respondents said they were faced with when expanding their operations outside of their local countries and the region. And another category that was covered in this study was reputation management. The vast majority of the leaders that were surveyed said that corporate reputations are less positive outside Asia Pacific. Many feel that their companies receive extra pushback, scrutiny from consumers as well as regulators in those markets compared to their home market. So again, it may not be more, but compared to what they were used to, it felt like it was more scrutiny. Expanding within the region, within Asia Pacific, was easier for them for that and other reasons. So all the leaders that were surveyed felt that, especially Chinese companies, felt that the Western markets made it more difficult for them to start operations or to enter or to commence a business in those particular countries. And in the interviews that were done to accompany the survey, 80% of the respondents said their company's reputation is more positive in Asia than in any other part of the world. The greatest challenge were from stated challenges were from China and India, where 43% said that their reputation inside Asia is much more positive than outside of Asia, whereas only 13% in South Korea said the same thing. Kind of a gap, significant gap. So those are kind of some of the interesting findings that, that came of our study. So that's the groundwork for what I want our panelists to talk about in the next half hour. Let me introduce them, starting with Ferry DeBacker, who is the adjunct lecturer at Nanyang Technological University's Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information. Could you come up on stage, Ferry? Also, Adam Najberg, he's the head of communications at Tencent Games Global. Adam, please come join us. And Vanessa So, head of communications at the Lazada Group. And I did that in the wrong order, but I apologize. Okay. All right, thanks for joining us on stage here. If I could get you to talk a little bit about your personal or your experience when it comes to some of these topics that were just mentioned and shown on the screens. Let me start off with the question, are the challenges to globalizing for Asian companies, since all of you have very, very deep Asia business experience, are the challenges to globalizing in 2022 any different than the challenges that Asian companies faced, say, in 2002? Ferry, let's start with you.
Yes, yes, certainly. A lot of new challenges. For Chinese companies in particular, the government the changes that the government have imposed on Chinese companies. Then there is the geopolitical situation, which is actually much more serious than the optimism that I noticed at the beginning of the session this morning justifies. And to get an idea how serious, I would recommend you watch a YouTube video, an interview at the American Council for Public Affairs with Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong, particularly what the Russian invasion of Ukraine means for Asia and for Asian businesses and for Asian countries. So I think that is very important. And also there is something like cancel culture. There is more focus on purpose, which means Asian companies exporting to Europe or the United States would have to be more communicative about their purpose. And there is indeed the corporate reputation, although that doesn't go for all Asian companies. There are many success stories, including Singapore Airlines, Uniqlo, Japanese fashions, other Japanese fashion companies. So, but yeah, I think it has become much more difficult, in particularly the trade disputes and the geopolitical situation, which forces companies to take stands, or to get basically excluded from certain markets that they had, had already opened. Think of Huawei, for example, in the United States, and in other countries where the 5G technology has, initially approved and then later not approved. So it's become much more difficult, I think.
Okay, thank you. Adam?
Well, first of all, I think it's fairly astonishing, at least from the perspective of Chinese companies that were having this discussion at all. I was reading the other day, I think it was 54 years before Coca-Cola actually sold a single product overseas. So we're less than 30 years or 25 years in the case of Alibaba and Tencent, from whom I used to work for Alibaba. DJI is not even 20 years old. And yet these are companies that have DJI had a 70-80% share of the US market, for example, in drone technology, consumer drone technology. The challenges are the same challenges that everybody has. You need to know the market. You need the data. Data is the oil of modern day commerce. It's not exclusive to any kind of geographical region. Western companies that want to do business in China need to know their customers as well. I just think overall, the challenge that they face now is these are companies that have moved at light speed.
Very well when it comes to corporate reputation in Europe. So on the, where the difference really is, I think, for Asian companies to move into other countries is culture. And it's very difficult, I believe, particularly for Chinese companies. I have noticed in research that we did about 1.5 years ago on employee engagement, that it is very well accepted that the Japanese are different. Okay, we accept it. But the Chinese companies and Chinese management must behave in a way that Europeans understand. So that, I think, is very unfair. Some Chinese companies have made enormous blunders when it comes to acquiring businesses in the United States and in Europe. The famous documentary American Factory is an example, but there are also other examples completely in the other direction where Chinese companies have done particularly well. And I really like the example of Geely, which acquired Volvo. And I'm amazed if you were to read, for example, a case study in the Harvard Business Review about this acquisition. I'm totally amazed by the patience that that the Chinese management had, having to deal with not only engineers, but Swedish engineers, which can be ranked among the most difficult people to deal with. So there are examples of Asian companies, and particularly Chinese companies, who have done very well in that respect. But cultural differences is something that came up before this morning that really we should look at when it comes to moving overseas.
Right, right. Okay. Moving on to culture and way of working. Navigating the culture of overseas markets was cited as a common challenge by most of the study's respondents. Can you share with the audience any personal stories or stories that you're aware of, you heard, of Asian brands experiencing growing pains outside their home markets? And home market could be defined as their country or region. I think it just depends on the size of that particular company. But if you have any, I'm sure you do, but if you can share any real life stories with the audience, you don't have to name names. You can say company A. Please do so. Adam, I'll start with you.
Okay. Well, a certain game company that happens to be the largest in the world. So the world is separated into different gaming sectors. And what I mean is there's mobile, there's PC, and there's console. And in developing markets, you tend to see that free to download or free to play model being the one that is most acceptable because everybody has a cell phone. But a lot of people don't have $500 for a console and don't have a bitchin' gaming computer to play games on. They're very expensive. Plus the games cost like $70 a piece now. But just to speak to this point, I think that going into a market, China is wired for free to download. So we have a gigantic share of the Chinese market. We're very popular in developing markets. And we've made investments in studios, a couple dozen studios around the world that produce primarily for PC and console. The model that I think we are hoping catches on, because we have to, if you use the model of what Alibaba did, Alibaba beat everybody in China, all the Western companies, because it understood local habits and consumer habits. And people want shopping to be a social experience. They want exploding things on the screen and dancing bears. And Western people in the United States like very zen sites like Amazon. So it's the same thing in gaming. And I didn't realize this until I started working at Tencent. But what we're trying to do very simply is make the flow in both directions. So if there's great IP for a PC or console game outside of China, let's figure out how to help that studio convert its IP to mobile and sell it inside China. And likewise, if there's awesome mobile IP that we can port to another platform like a console or a PC, let's do that. And finally, this is all about developing AAA games being eventually platform agnostic. The cloud comes into this. I won't get into all the Web3 stuff, but essentially what we're talking about is one day it's really not going to matter what you have in your hand or on the coffee table at home. You'll be able to just start the game here and finish it there, and wherever you are, you'll be able to play it. And I think that's the direction that we see things moving business model-wise.
I know this question is on everyone's mind, but what is the difference between freemium and free-to-play? Just kidding. No difference, right? I didn't think so. Okay. Vanessa, any personal experiences or knowledge of Asian brands having growing pains outside of their home markets?
Well, I think there are definitely a lot of examples, that everyone can really think of. Personally, I do see this a challenge, but also an opportunity. And I always, whenever I travel around the offices and the markets that we are in, I always learn something new about the market. For example, when I go to Philippines, they are really very social driven, KOL driven. So is Thailand, right? And everything that they do is let's put it up on social platform, this and that, and everything is fun. Right, so they don't understand too much about, we need to also dish out some of serious, business messages that get no, the media is not going to write about it. So we have to, cultivate the understanding as much as we also need to learn what works in that market, and how do we actually work along with the landscape that we're presented with. I can give a personal experience of how, just this morning, I was on a call with our Indonesian team, and, we are going to be, participating in the G20, that happens next month. So we're actually doing a handover of electric vehicles to the Bali government. Provincial government, just this morning. So my team called me and said, like, yeah, it's happening today. I was like, great. And then they told me, like, it's taking place in a hub. I was like, okay, yes. And then like, then it's like, yeah, it's a hub. I was like, okay. so they sent me photos and videos shortly after. Then I called them and I was like going, oh, I didn't realize. What do you mean by a hub until I saw the photos, right? So it's not like a big warehouse, and because it's a provincial government, not the central government in Jakarta. So it's a very humble looking place. Right, so I was asking them, all right, so how should we talk about this then? Because it's the G20, right? So these are the sort of things that, very often me sitting here in Singapore, I may not realize, the context of it until I get to the market, or until, that the market, sends me photos and then, videos, and then I see, okay, what's really happening on the ground. And another example would be, with the religious differences, in Southeast Asia, right? So when Ramadan comes along, Friday is a day when we try not to arrange any long meetings after 3 p.m., right? And I've had colleagues who are not.
Or talk about food.
Yes, I'll talk about, well, you can. So that's the thing between, even among the same religious groups, like, I see different practices. So say in Malaysia versus say Indonesia, right? So I do have colleagues, who come from different parts of the world, right? And when I say different parts of the world, I don't just mean China, right? We have colleagues who are from Europe, colleagues who are from US, right? So, and they've been here quite a number of years. But still, right, when it comes to arranging meetings during Ramadan, right, during the 1 month of fasting, it's really hard for us to say, let's stop our meetings after 3 p.m. or let's not all have any lunch at all for the one whole month. So, practices, business still have to go on, but we just have to learn to be respectful of what's happening, in every country.
Barry, what's your favorite case study that you like to communicate to your students?
Okay, well, my favorite case studies are actually too old to be used here. Since I retired 22 years ago, and I've been in Singapore for the last 14. But I will share two short ones. One has to do with a cognac company, a French company, that I've been chairman of for 20 years, and where we, in the last 20 years, have attempted to conquer parts of the Asian market. And what we have learned are the usual things like relationships matter, things take time, you have to worry for corruption. Things are not as easy as they look. For example, we have a client in China who suddenly appeared in France and bought for a gigantic amount, over 4 million euros, of cognacs. This was about the same size of our entire revenue, and then. So we thought, oh, this is very easy. And then he said, well, actually, you have to price down the cognacs to about 15% of the total order, and the other 85% will have to be like services because of the tax situation. And also, I want you to ship to Hong Kong first and then to China, because that's where we can arrange how the cognacs can be imported in a way that is important for my company. The managing director or the CEO of the company who bought the cognac suddenly disappeared for 6 months. I guess was part of President Xi's anti-corruption drive. So that's just one example of how things that look easy suddenly turn out to be very difficult.
Or should be easy.
Yeah. So, and on the other side, I don't have a case study yet, but I will have a case study next year, as my son and a good friend of his and I are launching a watch company next week at the Singapore Watch Fair. It's a high-end, diverse watch specialist company. It's a Singapore company. Yeah. The concept is Singaporean, the design is Singaporean, the manufacturing is in Switzerland. To your point that companies are actually less national than you think. Yeah. And so the first thing we're going to do is to conquer the Singapore market and then go on to Hong Kong and China, and then hopefully later on in Europe. So I don't know how that will go, but in a few years' time I can tell you.
Well, my watch just died, so I will be contacting you. Since we have 5 minutes, I want to throw a real quick question to you, and it's not going to be, doesn't require a lot of explaining, but do you feel personally that the current geopolitical challenges is the new normal, or that every Asian brand needs to, I guess, live with? Or is it something that will likely just disappear very quickly, like coronavirus did? Just kidding. So do you think this is something that everyone should just kind of say, hey, we should just look at this as a very long-term challenge? Or would you advise your management, to plan for, it being gone in, a couple years?
Well, I think to be fair, it has always been. I mean, the world order didn't just come about in the last 4 years or 5 years, right? I mean, the world order has been around for like hundreds of years. It's just a matter of how have we heightened that awareness. And yes, the awareness seems to be a lot higher now compared to, say, 10 or 20 years ago. But I wouldn't say it's any different from how it was back then.
Okay. Anyone else?
I just watched the 3-part series from Ken Burns, the U.S. and the Holocaust. And, I know that part of history. My family is tied to that part of history, unfortunately. But I didn't realize how anti-immigrant the U.S. was at that time. I thought it's just now. And you realize you tend to have this tunnel vision. You think yours is the only era in history. If I were advising senior people, and I am advising them actually, I would say realize that everything goes in cycles, and also understand that we're at a point now where every time you have kind of a change to 4G to 5G, from Web 2 to Web 3, there's all from VHS or Betamax, whatever. The question is, who is going to call the shots? Who has the orthodoxy or the lock on the orthodoxy? And I think this is pretty normal.
Very normal?
No, not normal. I do agree on the cycle theory, but I think we're at the beginning of a cycle of much more difficult period politically around the world, with multiple conflicts that can easily get out of hand, even worse than it is today. And that as management of companies, you'll have to prepare for that. Just a point in case. The cognac company, our biggest clients are in China and in Russia, and the Ukraine. So 2 of the 3 markets have suddenly disappeared for us, which is like 35% of our revenue. That's how.
But it could be temporary.
Sorry?
It could be temporary.
It could be temporary. I'm saying, we're talking about cycles here, and I think we're at the beginning of a very difficult cycle.
Okay.
I'm not optimistic.
All right. Any questions from the audience? You don't have to. I'm not forcing you, but giving you an opportunity, either to myself or any of our panelists. All right, then let's give a warm round of applause to our participants here. Thank you, everyone. Be on the lookout.